Supreme Court case and history, and a big chunk of that history is the story of our tribe's removal from our homelands in the southeast onto land west of the Mississippi in what later became known as the Trail of Tears. And my ancestors played a controversial role in the Cherokee story of that. And so this is where the book picks up, where they're sort of they've fought for a Supreme Court case. They actually won the Supreme Court case, but Andrew Jackson is refusing to enforce it, and so Cherokees are having a hard time staying on their land because Georgia is using a lot of violence to try and drive them out. From his education and years of diplomacy, John could see what was politically possible, arguably more than most of his fellow Cherokees. John began thinking about the previously unthinkable, signing away the land of their ancestors in exchange for land out west. It's a heartbreak many oppressed people have known, but one we don't like to talk about because it shatters our notions of progress. The heartbreak of giving up on justice because you know it's not possible. What had changed was not John's desire for Cherokee Nation to remain in their homeland. It was his hope. In their private meeting, even Andrew Jackson sensed the emotional reversal taking place inside the Cherokee leader. In a letter to an old war buddy, Jackson called it despair. Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot would spend the next 3 years writing petitions, making speeches, holding public meetings, and advocating for their fellow citizens to support a removal treaty. They became known as the Treaty Party. Removal to them was the only option in which Cherokees as a people and a nation would survive. Did we act in such emergencies as these for our private comfort, we might choose to die here and bury our bones in the land of our fathers, they wrote in one letter, where white people might desecrate our tombs with the plowshare of the farmer. But when we think of our children, they pleaded, we will at all hazards seek freedom in the far regions of the West. On December 29th, 1835, the Treaty Party met in the home of Elias Boudinot. Though unelected or appointed by the Cherokee people, the men signed their names to the Treaty of New Echota. Unable to read or write in English, Major Ridge signed his name with an X. He told the others, I have signed my death warrant. It is one thing to choose a death of honor. It is another to choose a death of disgrace. The Ridges forfeited their lives for the Cherokee cause, knowing they would be remembered not for their sacrifice, but for their treason. The treaty was, however, wholly undemocratic and illegal. The Cherokee people had voted down a removal treaty through public meetings and their elected representatives multiple times. By circumventing democracy, the treaty denied Cherokees the right to think for themselves. The Treaty Party's justification for their illegal act was the immense suffering of the Cherokee people. But shouldn't the Cherokee people, as they argued at the time, decide best how to relieve their own suffering? And under the treaty, their suffering would get immeasurably worse. Historians still debate whether or not the United States committed genocide against indigenous peoples. The crime has never been acknowledged by our government. At the time, the term did not exist. The word genocide, coined in 1944 during the Holocaust, combines the Greek prefix henos, which means race or tribe, and the Latin suffix cide, meaning killing. In 1948, the crime was defined by the United Nations as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group by one or more acts of physical violence. The Cherokee word for our removal is Dgeja-i Lustana-i. It literally means when they drove us. It is the same word we use to talk about herding animals. To prepare, the Army split logs, drove them into the ground lengthwise, and built 25 open-air stockades. The majority of Cherokee people believed the treaty was still being renegotiated, and that, if successful, they would stay. Earlier that spring, they had planted their fields of corn, looking towards the fall harvest. But on May 25th, 1838, 7,000 U.S. soldiers and militiamen went into the hills and valleys of Cherokee Nation to round them all up. Cherokees, startled by bayonets in their gardens or kitchen, were not allowed to collect any possessions for the journey or to find their loved ones. At gunpoint, the militia drove a woman in labor from a remote valley town to the main concentration camp. Even after she gave birth, they would not let her rest. Finally, on a riverbank near the stockade, she lay down and died. The army was woefully unprepared to feed and house their thousands of captives. The open-air stockades provided no shelter or sanitation. There was not even a place to use the bathroom. At night, militiamen roamed the camps, abducting and assaulting Cherokee women. By fall, Cherokees had buried 2,000 of their fellow citizens. As a newspaper reported at the time, that is 1/8 of the whole number in less than 4 months. When Cherokees marched west that winter, death followed. People walked over 1,000 miles. The footsteps of thousands left a trench in the earth. Although the exact number is unknown, one missionary estimated 4,000 people died between the camps and removal, a quarter of the total population. And people blamed the Ridges. On the morning of June 22nd, 1839, John Ridge and his family awoke to a loud noise. A group of armed men kicked in their front door. They dragged John from his bed into the front yard. 2 men held John's arms while the others held his body. They stabbed him 29 times. They threw John's body up into the air and stomped on his chest until it caved in. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they left. John was still alive when his wife, Sarah, was finally able to reach him. He tried to speak to her, but all that came out of his mouth was blood. Sarah sent a runner to warn Major Ridge of the danger. The runner returned with the news Major Ridge was also dead. By my grandmother, I was raised to believe that the assassinations were vengeful and wrong. As an adult, however, I do not agree. For what the Ridges did, I think they had to die. According to the very law Major Ridge had helped pass, the punishment for unlawfully ceding Cherokee land was death. And unlike the Republic of the United States at the time, our much older democracy followed the law. According to an even older law, our traditional blood law, for the souls of those who died on the Trail of Tears to rest in peace, their deaths had to be avenged. Otherwise, their blood would forever cry out for justice. From that view, the deaths of my family members allowed the souls of thousands to pass on to the next world. How could that not be justified? The Ridges are still considered traitors by a majority of Cherokees, a fate I think they accepted before they died. If what they had been trying to save was their own legacy, they would have never signed that treaty. What I believe they truly cared about, however, did come true. Cherokees as a people and a nation are still here. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for reading that. You're kind of cool. But no, thank you so much for reading that specific part of your book, because what you just read has to do with a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. And you briefly touched on this in the very beginning, but once you started reading, but your book is centered around a specific case that had come up with the Muskogee Nation. Can you go ahead and talk us through that case that you apply inside your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the case, the Supreme Court case is called McGirt v. Oklahoma. It was decided by the Supreme Court in 2020, and it resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. So prior to the Supreme Court decision, Oklahoma had acted as if no reservation still existed within the state. And as a consequence of the decision, about half, almost half of the land in Oklahoma is now recognized as reservation land. And the case actually started in an unexpected place. So in 1999, a Muskogee citizen murdered another Muskogee citizen on the Muskogee Reservation, and he was tried and sentenced to death by the state of Oklahoma. And it was actually in the course of his death penalty appeals that his lawyer argued, hey, Oklahoma, you don't have the jurisdiction to execute my client because this happened on tribal land, and states don't have the power to prosecute tribal citizens on tribal land. And so that question, it took literally 20 years, but that question eventually wound its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And just to give a little bit of the legal context, what happened to our reservations in eastern Oklahoma is that they went through allotment. And so at one point prior to Oklahoma becoming a state, all the land was owned communally by the tribe. And what Congress did in its infinite wisdom, well, really in an effort to open the land up for more white settlement, was take all that communally owned tribal land, divide it up, and assign each tribal citizen an individual parcel of land. And so Oklahoma argued that got rid of the reservation, but there are reservations all across the country that went through allotment, and the test is whether or not in like those laws that Congress passed, is it saying, we're diminishing the reservation, these lands return to the public domain. Basically, there's sort of hallmark language you look for in the congressional statute to say, oh yeah, Congress was by this act not just allotting the land and privatizing it, but literally getting rid of the reservation. And that language just didn't exist. And so the law was clearly on the tribe's side, but I think a lot of people would fear is because upholding the reservation would upset the status quo in so much in Oklahoma that the court still wouldn't side with the tribe, even though the law was on the tribe's side. So that's kind of the story of the case. So it was really exciting in 2020 when we won.
Yeah, no, I remember seeing bits and pieces of that case and just thinking, well, as a Native woman in general, I wasn't really surprised that this is something that we still deal with, and that in 2020 we have to go up to the Supreme Court to establish and say, yes, this is our land. We are a sovereign nation. You need to treat us as such. But the general case that you used, McGirt versus Oklahoma, it's kind of crazy case. We're talking about murder. And the fact that the Muskogee Nation had to build upon that case to kind of just implement their sovereignty. Do you think because the case was built on the topic of murder, that it kind of created any sort of misunderstanding about the whole, what it really boiled down to with the Muskogee Nation?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And that was something, I tried to give space to in the book. I think for a lot of people who are watching the Supreme Court decision in 2020, it was this great victory. But at the center of the cases are families who were really negatively impacted by the original crimes. And so the man who was murdered was named George Jacobs, and the murder was pretty brutal. He was mutilated. And so for his family, I think that's still a really big source of trauma. And then to have the case, be opened back up and go on for so long, and for them to have to go through more trials is absolutely a part of the story of what happened. Because of the way the law works, tribes don't always have the space to bring cases on their own behalf. Tribes don't always have the legal standing because our legal standing under US law is so precarious. And so it's actually not uncommon for really important cases in the arena of federal Indian law to come from crimes, especially cases about jurisdiction and reservation boundaries and things like that. So a lot of times it starts with a dispute like this. And I think, I talked to then principal chief of Muskogee Nation, James Floyd, And he's from, the murder took place in Vernon, and both the victim and the perpetrator are from a small community called Royale. And Chief Floyd was from Trenton. His family's from Trenton, they're all just kind of in the same area. And they're really small communities, so he knew members of the Jacobs family. So that was something that really weighed heavily on his mind when he was making the decision of whether or not the tribe should get involved. And he basically sort of made the decision of, well, if we don't get involved, this case is being brought and will be decided whether or not we join. And we can't sort of let people make these arguments about our reservation and not get involved. And then what happened once the case got to the Supreme Court, there was this tricky thing that happened where Neil Gorsuch had actually recused himself. So Justice Gorsuch came to the Supreme Court bench through the 10th Circuit, and that's how Murphy also went to the Supreme Court. It went through the 10th Circuit, and he hadn't been part of the 3-judge panel, but he had taken place in a procedural vote. And so generally, if you're on the Supreme Court and you participated in a case when it was in a lower court, you recuse yourself from the case. It's just kind of the way they do things. And so the thinking is that in Murphy, the justices were caught in a 4-4 tie. And so they actually punted Murphy and didn't make a decision in that case. That's why the case is called McGirt v. Oklahoma, not Murphy v. Oklahoma. So then they picked a case of a defendant who had been incarcerated in Oklahoma. And because of the type of appeal that he had filed, it went through Oklahoma's state court and had not gone through the 10th Circuit. So Gorsuch could weigh in. He eventually writes the decision. They had like an odd 9 justices. They could make like a decision and write it instead of getting caught in that tie. And so there is another victim of that. Mr. McGirt's crimes were around childhood sexual abuse and the sexual assault of a very young child. And so I know for that victim and her family, this being brought up and him winning also meant that they had to go through a new federal trial. And so, 20 years after the original crime, or about 20 years, she had to testify again and kind of go through all of that trauma. And in her testimony, she talks about how disruptive that's been to her life, which I can only imagine. So I think that it's really important in the ways that we talk about these cases that we don't lose sight of some of the people who are most impacted by it, and that while for many tribal citizens in eastern Oklahoma, it's this great victory, for those families, it's reopening old trauma and old wounds. And I think, too, it's important to realize that for the tribe, it wasn't this decision of, okay, we support these men being released, right? And both of them were retried in federal court. Mr. Murphy is still in prison. Mr. McGirt got a lesser sentence, but then because of a parole violation is back in incarceration. And so, but it's complicated. And I think one of the things, both with the history and with the present day, I try to hold in the book is that, sometimes we want our victories to be like all good, right? It's like, okay, this was a good thing for the tribe, so it came from a good place and everything is squeaky clean and morally clear. And I just don't think that that's the way the world nor history works. And it's not the way that this case worked.
Yes, I think that you really answered that well, because you're absolutely right. We do need to acknowledge the simplicity of the case and who it really impacted, the loved ones, the family members closely. And then after so many years, having to talk about it again in such a very open space where everyone knows about it now. But then also, this slight victory that came from it of, having won that case. So it really was important that we took a chance to talk about that a little bit more. Because this case makes up a huge portion of your book. And you're absolutely right with that word, complex. It's so difficult to speak with people, especially from people who don't grow up within Indigenous communities or around Indigenous communities, of that relationship between federal and tribal law, how complex and sticky it can be in trying to do things by the book or the right way. in the system of the federal government, and it wasn't on accident. And I think that you do talk about that in your book, which we'll get to later. But I did want to hint to that I really do appreciate that in your book, you really do talk about that, and I just loved it. Personal bit. So we're going to be using the term native land every so often in this discussion, and I just want to make sure that everyone here and that's watching this stream understands what that means. So what does native land mean in a general term, and then also to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first place to start is the legal definition. And so it's called, under the law, native land's called Indian country. And there are 3 types. So there's reservations, which I think people are like the most familiar with. And then there's also allotments, and then what's called dependent Indian communities. And so, tribal land looks like a lot of different things. There's like Navajo Nation, which is like larger than many US states. And then, there are tribes that have, either small reservations or small pieces of trust land. Our reservations in eastern Oklahoma are really unique because we've had so much white settlement and there's so much land within our reservations, like over 95% of the land within our reservations are owned by folks who aren't tribal citizens, or it's fee land. And so tribal land and under the law can look really different, but generally it's either where there's still some degree of tribal or federal supervision, and that it falls under that jurisdiction. Now, I think native land is like the entire continent, right? Yeah. So, of course, like we're on both, the historic treaty territories and the ancestral homelands of indigenous peoples whenever we're anywhere within North America or South America, for that matter. And so that's sort of the definition. One of the ways that reservations got their names is because in treaty language, what the tribes were ceding or given up was written down, and then everything that was not being given up was reserved for the tribes. And so you can kind of think of that land as like what we were able, through generations of struggle, what we were able to hold on to under the law, which I think is a testament to not only our current endurance, looking at the leadership of Muskogee Nation that won this historic Supreme Court case in 2020, but the generations of people before them, that fought to hold on to the things that they held on to, both big and small.
Yes. That's great. Thank you. And when we talk about native land, for us as Indigenous people, we hold such huge significance to the land. You're right, the whole, all of it, Turtle Island, everything. We love all of it, but especially the parts that belong to us technically, our own sections, those matter to us a lot because one, it's where we can be, it's where some of us have grown up, it's where we can, really reflect and come back home to. So why is native land so vital to everyone, but especially Indigenous people from the past and the future?
Yeah, I think often when people think about what tribes lost, they think in terms of just like real estate, right? But that's just what white people gained, and what we lost is so much more, right? We lost access to sacred sites, to traditional plants and medicines, language, culture, life ways, just the histories. Like when I travel back to our homelands, just the histories and the stories that are in, this rock or this mountain, and different sites that, contain like very important, stories that have to do with our, creation and origin as a people. And so being removed from that is a huge loss. And so I think that you can't separate out land, culture, language, and sovereignty. I think that they're all interconnected. And whenever we lost land, those other things, whether it was being able to transmit our language and our culture to our young people, whether it was our, sovereignty and our legal standing, all those things often also suffered. But I think that the converse is also true, where Native people have been able to maintain land bases is often where you see culture still being practiced and languages still being spoken. And so I think especially in Oklahoma, so after we went through allotment, families, it became the duty of individual families to pass land down and to hold on to it for allotments to remain restricted. And generally where there's like a higher volume or, percentage of areas where there's still a lot of restricted allotment land are like the pockets of our nation where people are still speaking the languages. And so I'm sure you can speak to how that's true on Navajo, but I think it's the reason that land is so valuable to Native people is because it holds more than just the value of, real estate that we might think of in kind of a Western lens, but it's oftentimes a cradle or a protector of these other things that are really valuable to us. And I would say intrinsic to who we are as Indigenous people.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of people really do focus on the word land. We really think really logical about it, especially when we talk about, movements like Land Back, where they think we're talking about people's homes and what we're standing on. But really we mean our connection. Without the land, it is not possible for us to connect to Mother Earth, to conduct our spirituality and our culture. It means so much. Without the land and without taking care of her and connecting with her, that's the basis and the foundation of being Indigenous and feeling those properties that are so very important and sacred to us. So it is amazing that in your book you do highlight, yes, sovereignty and having those spaces is important, but here's why it's also important, not just having the ownership of it, but the reasons behind it as well. During your reading, you included your personal family history about the Trail of Tears, and something that I can really relate to you in that respect is that, yes, you're Cherokee and I'm Navajo, and both of us have exactly the same type of history where our people have had forced removal, and we have the same shared trauma about that, where you had the Trail of Tears and my people had the Long Walk. And I really did admire the fact that you were so honest about including your connection and what your ancestors have contributed to the Trail of Tears and what it was really all about. But can I ask why you decided to include that into your story?
Yeah, I thought that it was essential to talk about removal and the history of removal for people to understand why the reservations were so important to tribal citizens today. Like when I saw the Supreme Court decision, I wept. Like I wasn't just like jumping up and down and excited, like I sobbed. And most of the other tribal citizens that I spoke to that day were in a similar emotional place. And I think because we know the losses and the struggles that preceded, that what Joy Harjo called like that one act of justice. And so I wanted the reader to experience that too. Like I wanted the reader to not just be like, oh, cool, like, the Supreme Court like gave some land back to some tribes, like to really understand all that it took, like the generations of struggle for that one court decision to be possible. And I think and so for me, including the removal history was essential. I think too, when I was doing the reporting and talking to a lot of tribal citizens, it was this idea of, well, we lost our homelands once and we rebuilt. And if the reservation is disestablished, it's like losing it all over again. And so I think it was really important for people to bring in the stakes. And then, in terms of like telling the story of John and Major Ridge, I've got a cousin in the room who probably shares this sentiment. I grew up with their stories. Like, it just was like taught to me and like instilled in me from a very young age, like how important what they did was for our tribe. I was told a very specific version of their story where like they were saints and John Ross was evil and, everybody got it wrong. And so it was really, I appreciated as an adult going back to the historical record and re-examining it as an adult. And honestly, I felt like I both developed a greater appreciation of how dedicated they were to the Cherokee people, to the survival of Cherokee Nation, and the sacrifice that they made. Like, they knew they were going to be killed. They 100% knew what the outcome was going to be. And they also knew, I think, how generations of people would see them, that Cherokees would see them as traitors. And to me, I think there's a lot of like bravery in that kind of leadership. But then also, the part that I struggle with is the idea that, I think any people, Cherokee people especially, should be able to decide for themselves what their future should be. My ancestors took that away by signing an illegal treaty. And so I think that there is like an ethical part of that I can't agree with. But the reason I really wanted to write about it is because I think that often, like, we tell this history, and I think, like, Muskogee sometimes, like, tell the story of, like, McIntosh, like, we tell the story of the Ridges, like, where we tell the story of the Trail of Tears of, like, oh, well, it happened because, like, these bad people signed a bad treaty. And I think what you can learn in the Ridges' desperation is to the extent that Cherokees were literally fighting to survive. And they were arguing and fighting within themselves, like, how best to survive genocide. And it's not like subtext, like they're shooting off letters and making speeches of like, if we don't do this, we will no longer exist. And I think that it's really important for us to understand what Indigenous people in that period of time were up against. And I think that's what I really got from spending time with, my ancestors' words and their actions, was that they were really, really fighting for the survival of Cherokee people against the sort of unforgiving and unrelenting policy of ethnic cleansing. And I think that, and I think what happened within Cherokee Nation isn't just Cherokee Nation. A lot of tribes have had these moments where, people fight over, is it armed resistance? Is it diplomacy? Is it staying or is it going? Like, how do we best keep intact what is most important to us? And even often within tribes, within Cherokee Nation, people made different decisions, right? And I think, what we can learn from that is just I think what's better to focus on is U.S. policy and what created those divisions within the tribe was just, again, the unrelenting policy of ethnic cleansing.
And I do like the word that you're using, the phrase ethnic cleansing, because like you said earlier, it's so rare that people use that language, just saying it for what it is, genocide, ethnic cleansing of what happened to our people in the very beginning of our colonization of where we were. And your book takes turns flip-flopping between what was happening then versus what's happening now. And it's a really great way for people who are reading it to fully understand not only the amount of time that we're continuing to struggle with it and how it matters today, because you're right, we were surviving at that time. We're in a time where everything is changing. We're being forced to go to different places and to do different things and to live in a different society and understand people who live in a very different way than we were. And I think that it's really important that with your book, you take those turns where we talk about what's going on with the Cherokee Nation and then what's going on with the Muskogee Nation at the same time. So by using American, specifically Native history with American history, How is that relevant to include when we're talking and having a conversation about contemporary land rights?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that so much of when I was like reading the history and reading about these things in the book, so much of it just like reminded me of the present day and like what's happening in politics today. So, there's been a lot of news coverage of our current administration not following federal court orders. And that's what Andrew Jackson did in 1832, right? And so I think that there's this idea that the lawlessness or the disregard for the law is something new or something that is emerging in this political moment, when actually it's been going on since the founding. And so, one of the biggest struggles that tribes have is that, through our advocacy, whether that looked like diplomacy, I mean, sometimes it looked like war, sometimes it was advocacy, was that we, carved out a space within US law for our rights and our lands to be recognized. And we have to constantly fight for those laws to be followed, knowing that they often will not. And so this kind of, this strain of lawlessness has been there since the beginning, but now it's sort of getting a larger platform. But as Indigenous people, we've been experiencing it all the time. I mean, it's sort of like a truism that, the US doesn't uphold the treaties. And it's kind of just this thing that people say flippantly. And it's like, well, according to our Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. So what is that doing to our democracy when an oppressed group of people have specific legal rights and our government doesn't follow it? Where else will our government not follow the law, right? I think the other thing that was a theme in the book that I think really relates to the present day is this idea of lies and how lies are constantly used to justify what is otherwise unjustifiable. And you would think that there would be no way to argue that the Trail of Tears was morally right. You would think that there would be no way. But when the bill that preceded it, which was called the Indian Removal Act, was being debated in Congress, Southern lawmakers were making this argument that Cherokees weren't going to be okay living so close to white people. They sort of talked about how it was this corrupting influence for Cherokees to live so close to white people. They were diminishing, they were dying, ignore the fact that like Georgia is like literally, harassing and terrorizing Cherokee citizens. But it was this rhetorical argument that actually what's best for Cherokee people is to move west of the Mississippi. And the person who conceived of this idea of there being like an Indian territory west of the Mississippi, like he was sort of one of those like do-gooder white people, and his idea was that, oh, this is what's gonna save Indigenous people, is actually like removing them from their homelands. And so that argument was there. The same thing happened with allotment when our land was privatized and divided up. The story wasn't, we need to open this land to white settlers. They're demanding it. They're coming to Congress and they're petitioning Congress. They came up with this lie that, oh, well, Native people are poor because they don't have private land and they're not like good enough at capitalism. And so we have to like force them into capitalism by privatizing their land and dividing it up. And so, and then you see it with the present day, after we won our reservations, Oklahoma, particularly our governor, Kevin Stitt, sort of started telling all of these lies about sort of like the jailhouse doors like flying open and all these criminals running free. And they came up with these like statistics sort of that were from Mars about like, 76,000 past convictions getting overturned and things like that, that just, once it's very easy to like get into the numbers and disprove, but was still salient, so salient that they won a subsequent Supreme Court decision giving them back some prosecutorial power on tribal land, so that the lies that they came up with held water at the Supreme Court. And so I think we're talking a lot today about like disinformation or misinformation or people lying. And again, I think it's something that's been part of the fabric of our country for a long time. It's just sort of like who was being lied to and who was being lied about might have been a point where we weren't paying attention as much. But I think that, injustice is never saying, oh, like we know that we're on the wrong side of history. We just, are greedy, so we're going to take what we want. Like people never act that way. There's sort of always a reverse logic or like a lie to sort of justify what is fundamentally unjust. And I think you can see that especially throughout U.S. history and the treatment of Indigenous people. Every harmful policy towards us has been surrounded by lies about why it was actually what was best for us. And so I think that those are lessons that we can learn to understand our present political moment better.
Yep, and it's really great that you're doing my job for me, because you are kind of dabbled in between, some of the policies and laws that have been used in the past. And while I was, you guys weren't there, but I was talking to Rebecca before we started, and I had joked with her and said, well, I was stalking with you, and so I was stalking you, and I was trying to get up some good questions for you. Not that well, but I actually found a really good interview that you had with Democracy Now!, and you said something that kind of just really struck with me, and I just thought, like, oh my goodness, this girl, she is awesome, and I need to read it to you guys, okay? So, View has said, the policies and the power our government gave itself to dispossess Indigenous peoples of our land still governs how we treat people living in the margins of U.S. empire. Which, yes. And it made me really think just how, for Indigenous history, we don't often think about how it's reflected into issues to this day, or at least we don't really have that much of a conversation about it. And I've noticed that as a Native, when we're talking about our people's history and our past, it feels so fractured to the present day. It feels like we're often disassociated, or that, like this is what happened in the past, but, everything worked out in the end, and, it has nothing to do with what's going on now. And, working in, in an industry where I'm constantly having to educate people about, one, that we're still here, that we still exist, and we're still doing the things that we need to do, but also that we are still struggling with some of the issues that have begun when the United States was becoming the United States. And in this interview, you had talked about several things connecting our Indigenous history to what's going on today. And I really liked for you to talk more about that and just explain to us how Native history is prevalent in today's politics and policies that the United States governs itself with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you have to just one step back and look at the fact that, the United States, when it was created, was basically a small string of colonies hugging the eastern seaboard. And then it went on throughout its, 250-year almost history to colonize lands, expanding first to the West Coast and then Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico. And, in that colonization, we have committed massacres. We have committed things that many people call genocide. We rounded up Native kids and forced them into boarding schools. We forcibly sterilized Native women. We have held governments that look extremely authoritarian and totalitarian in our colonies and in our territories, whether it be the Philippines or Puerto Rico. And we have never looked at that history and said, wow, we don't want that to repeat. Let's change our laws. Let's change our constitution. Let's make sure that our government can't do that again. And so now, when our government wants to hold enemy combatants indefinitely in the war on terror, when our government wants to separate families at the border, when our president wants to annex Greenland, our government has the power to do that because of the power it gave itself to dispossess indigenous peoples of our land. And so, Native history is often treated, like you said, like this sort of distant, tragic chapter of the American story, and the legal terrain that it created, like a siloed area of American law, but it's foundational. And so, when you look back at the founding, our founding fathers, they wanted a government that, unlike the King of England, operated by consent, right? This idea of the consent of the governed. But at the same time, they also wanted empire. And so they built both. And we think about, the laws that govern, the United States kind of looking in, but there's an entire body of law that governs the people outside. And so for our entire history as a country, we have always exercised power over peoples and lands where those people had no say, And I think our legacy and our inheritance as US citizens is a government that rules both by consent, but also by conquest. And I think it's particularly relevant now. There's this theory of fascism that became popular after the rise of fascism in Europe during World War II, that it's this idea of sort of like the boomerang of colonization, that like fascism is just colonization being exercised on the domestic. So like even what you see in like the current bill before Congress, where Medicare, Medicaid, like school lunches for kids, like everything that is like helping people is being cut. But what is still going to be funded is like ICE and like the police state. And like that kind of sort of technocratic government is like what colonized people experience, right? And so I think that to me, when I look out at like the current political landscape in the United States, I see people sort of going to Russia or going to Hungary or even going to like Nazi Germany to try to be like, okay, how do we understand how fascism takes root, without realizing that like it's already a root, like it's already here, it's been here the whole time. And the people that we need to learn from are the people who've experienced the authoritarian and the anti-democratic arms of the United States. Like we need to learn from the people who've been colonized by the US, and not just, indigenous peoples, but, people across the globe who have experienced the bad side of that. And so, so that's like a big answer, but that's how I think of it as connecting to our current political moment.
Yeah, no, I love listening to you talk about it because yes, I feel that way all the time, and it's really important that we have that discussion. And I think that this book is just a great opportunity to open up those broader thoughts too. I mean, because like even now, just listening to you talk about certain things and bringing up specific events and what has happened, I want to like branch off and then go off into like different topics too. But it really does open up the gates to having that discussion, and it's really important that we kind of bring it back down of saying, yeah, no, it's always existed, and it kind of sucks that we still have to talk about it and we still have to learn from it and hope that there's going to be a change in the future. We had this entire conversation and we talked a lot about, the laws and the politics and everything about that. But in the very beginning, I really wanted to bring us back a little bit where we talked about, indigenous land and sovereignty, and how, yes, it's important on a legality scope. It's extremely important in that way. But I want us to really bring it back down to when we had talked about it being significant in both a cultural and spiritual way. Mm-hmm. And as a Navajo woman who is not home, leaving home is really hard because it's our sense of identity. It's where I feel most connected. And we have Oklahoma and we have you guys, which is always great. But there's nothing like home where you feel this is where you belong. This is where I'm supposed to be. Yeah. And I looked at some of the interviews that you had, and I noticed that there is a huge connection in your title and just having that connection towards your personal heritage as a Cherokee woman. Can you explain what that is with your title?
Yeah. So the title of the book is it's adopted from a Joy Harjo poem called "Returning from the Enemy." And I'll just read a little bit of the poem. So she writes, "I have returned to the homelands beloved by my people, who were marched to the west by the authority of a piece of paper. I keep warm by the fire carried through cruelty." And so what Harjo is talking about in that poem, the fire, it's a literal fire. So, sometimes you'll hear Southeastern tribes talk about like the concept of one fire. And so our ceremonial fire was what kind of united us and sort of made us Cherokee, was the fire that we kept at like our mother town, and then would feed other fires in other communities and even in individual people's homes. And during removal, that fire was kept, and those ceremonial fires still burn in eastern Oklahoma. And for me, the symbolism of that fire is also this idea of the fight for sovereignty and the fight for land, as sort of a fire that we carry as Indigenous peoples. I interviewed Suzanne Harjo for the book, and she said this quote that really just stuck with me, and that I can't stop thinking about. But she was talking about how, everyone, because our reservations hadn't been recognized for over 100 years, and the argument on the other side was kind of like, well, that's so long, like, how can you come back now and claim it? And she was talking about time and about how, as Indigenous peoples, we can't give up. We can't ever stop asserting what is rightfully ours. Because even after all the losses we face, even if it's a century of loss, and the way she put it was, we're just on a longer timeline, right? We're on a longer timeline than other people are in this country, and that timeline is longer going backwards, but that timeline is also longer going forwards. And so I'll just leave you guys with that thought.
I love that. I love that so much. But no, before I get to my last question for you, I just want to take a minute to say that growing up for me, because I grew up on the Navajo reservation, and me and my sister, we joke about how we think that her and I are the last, at least for my family, of just growing up with both bits and pieces of what it was like before a big change. I grew up with my grandma, and she had a traditional hogan. And this was when we didn't have any electricity. We didn't have any running water. We had to wait for a truck to visit us every so often and hope that they're on time to give us a big gallon of something, and he would fill it in, which was the best water, by the way. And that's how we washed our hair and cooked and did everything. And we had an outhouse, which was super far and so fun to travel to go to the bathroom at 2 a.m. and you're 5 years old and you poke your mom and say, "Hey, I gotta go to the bathroom," and she says, "You'll be fine, go ahead and do it by yourself." And I love to tell people and share this memory of always waking up and hearing my grandma. She was a huge George Strait fan. She had such a huge crush on him. It was cute. But she'd play him on the radio, and I'm sleeping, and we're on the ground, and there's not even a tile. It's just dirt on the floor. And she used to get this bucket that we used to use to wash her hands, and she would throw the water on the ground to make it packed so it wasn't dusty everywhere, but just smelling that, how it smells right before it rains. And then from that image to what we have now, where we can have running water and we do have electricity, and some of us are really fancy because we have added bathrooms to our hogans now. And so having that introduction and having that those connections, I feel so protective over it.
Yeah.
Those memories and having, like, I think about, you know, if I ever to have kids or my sisters were to ever have kids, how I want them to have the exact same experiences I had as far as those ceremonies, you know, having that story, having that language, that connection of understanding what it's like to be Indigenous, what it's like to be Navajo. And I am so proud of how much of our people, how much of our women, because we're so awesome, have started to take the fight in our own hands. You know, we're actually, people are listening to us. You know, back then we did not have panels like this where people would come over here and listen to us talk about issues like this. We didn't have podcasts. We didn't have documentaries. No one really talked about these issues. And so taking the time to find this passion and to find something to write about and to share and coming out here is super important. And I think that I'm extremely inspired by people like you who do this, because we definitely need it. And I just get sentimental, so thank you so much. I feel like every time I come here, this is like the second time I did it, but like I always cry and I hate it, so sorry.
No, I mean, I think it's like these, it's really heavy, you know, both like what's at stake and what we're fighting to protect, you know, is really, it's really heavy. So I just have really, this conversation has been amazing. And so.
Well, thank you. So anyways, our last question. So we talked about, you know, where the inspiration for your title had come from and how it resonates with you. But I want this last question to just be a kind of a takeaway for our audience and those who are watching our live stream, is, you know, sorry, give me a second. You know, like, before everyone leaves today, I really want everyone to make sure that we internalize and think about this conversation. And if we were to have it with other people and say, yeah, I went to this thing at, you know, the Fayetteville Public Library, this is what it's about. The main takeaway is, you know, what does Indigenous sovereignty really boil down to? And how can we think about that in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, when I explain sovereignty, the place I always start is that it's inherent and it's not something that's granted or given to us by the United States. It is something that as Indigenous nations we possess because we existed before the United States was a country, before it was even an idea. And so our right to govern our lands, our peoples, our language, our cultures, is something that has always belonged to us. What has happened is that colonization has dramatically impacted, you know, what levels of sovereignty we are able to exercise, whether that's, you know, what crimes we can prosecute on our land, you know, what kind of regulations we can pass, you know, where our kids go to school, what kind of education they have access to, you know, how we get health care, what kind of medicine is accessible to us, you know. So all of these things have been dramatically impacted. And I think another really important distinction that I talk about a little bit in the book, but something that I think is really important for non-Native folks to understand, is that a lot of the times when we think about, you know, supporting or protecting marginalized or oppressed groups in the United States, we think about this framework of individual rights or civil rights. And that doesn't always quite work for tribal sovereignty. Sometimes it actually is like, there's like a conflict and it like is opposite because with tribes, we're not thinking about the rights of the individual, we're thinking about the rights of the group and the rights of the collective, which I think is different than what a lot of people think of when they think of supporting, you know, marginalized groups in the United States. And a lot of times there's this legal scholar called Maggie Blackhawk, named Maggie Blackhawk, who I interviewed for the book, and she always says this thing where it's not about rights, it's about power. It's about what power do we have to exercise our sovereignty. And so I think those are some things to think about moving forward. I also think that it's really important to realize that as, you know, things are changing very rapidly in our world and in our climate and in our ecological systems, that there are things that tribes are protecting that I think that are essential, not just to Indigenous people, but to all of us. And so I think that we need to start thinking about sovereignty as not just something that benefits Indigenous people, but something that's really critical for our world today, for all of us.
Yes.
Yeah, I got no more questions. Is it okay to like have people ask you questions?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, go for it.
I noticed in the book and in your reporting, maybe I should set the table a little bit. I think we're so divided in our conversations often in society and in politics, and especially when you're a person who holds a minoritized identity and you're trying to just like be heard, make a point, not get bulldozed. It feels more complicated, but we're like always, wherever we are, trying to hold the moral high ground, trying to be heard, be right, be taken seriously. And you do this amazing work of taking complicated things and holding space for all sides of it. You spoke about your family's history. I noticed in reading the book, I'm like perpetually learning, but the complicated, not complicated, the hard truth that the Cherokee people, amongst other Indigenous people, had enslaved Black people. That's a really hard part of history, and a hard thing I would think as a person with an Indigenous identity to like concede in a book that you're writing, to reconcile that as you're writing it. And I just wanted to know your philosophy around how you're creating that space and how you hold space and how you can still feel like you're moving a point forward without losing ground while holding all those truths together at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's really important to understand like the difference between things that are complicated and things that aren't, if that makes sense. Like I think a lot of times people treat things like they're complicated when there's like there's really clear morality, And I think sometimes that complication is like used to obfuscate like when things are clearly wrong. I think that you bringing up Cherokee's history of adopting chattel slavery from the United States is like a good example. Like, it's wrong, right? Like, there's no, the historical circumstances are complicated. What we were going through is complicated, but whether or not that was right or wrong, like, that's clear. It is wrong to treat humans like property, period, right? And so I think that, sometimes we live in a society where we have a hard time both with like having clear moral stances on issues, and I feel like that's just like rapidly degrading. Like, it's like people feel complicated about what's happening in Gaza, and it's like actually it's wrong that babies are starving to death. Like that's just kind of like babies shouldn't starve to death. Like I don't know what else to say. And at the same time, I think we also have a hard time because I think we want things to be all or nothing. And I think specifically, and I don't know if it's like Star Wars or superhero movies, but we want like the good guy to be like all the way good. And we want like the bad guy to be like an evil villain. And it's like generally things are more complicated than that, I think it's actually extremely common in world history for oppressed groups to oppress other people, right? And so, I think it's important for us to talk as Cherokees to take account for our history of enslaving people, both from a moral standpoint, but also like we were talking about sovereignty. And to me, sovereignty is one of the reasons why that responsibility is important, because if we are truly a sovereign nation, right? If we are truly sovereign, then we are responsible for our mistakes. And like any other government that has enslaved people, we have to take account for what we did, right? And so, and so I think that that's, for me, is kind of the guiding star. Is like, I think sometimes journalists, I get very frustrated with my profession because I think in situations where there are like clear right or wrongs, we can sort of like both sides it in a way that I think actually obfuscates the truth. You know, I think if our true pursuit is truth, I think it's important to be like clear-headed about it. But that doesn't mean that things are all or nothing, right? Which I think we also live in a society where there's a lot of like all or nothing thinking. And I also just think that one of the ways that oppression, in the mechanics of how oppression works, is that a lot of times people like adopt things from the oppressor, and like that, you know, that's just part of like our history. And I think hopefully, as Indigenous people, we can unlearn the ways that we have done that and unlearn the ways that we have like perpetuated white supremacy within our tribes. But that, you know, it's happened, right? And so it's like, I don't think it serves us to pretend like it didn't. So yeah, but thank you for that question. I mean, and I appreciate you reflecting that back to me, because that's something I strive to do. It's like hold these multiple truths at the same time, but to still be very like clear about it. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
You say all, I would love to talk about many things, but you say all the things in this book. And you hold major media outlets to account, your own ancestors, tribes, the state of Oklahoma and the governor in particular. Like, it's all there. Have you faced any blowback from any of these various factions?
That's a good question. Not too bad. So, you know, you always like, so whenever I'm critical of someone, I always reach out to them to give them like a chance for comment. That's just sort of like part of what you do as a journalist. And so, you know, when we were reaching out to people for comment, actually probably like the most pushback we got was from the Washington Post. So they had ran a very inaccurate article. And I was curious about what the journalists' conversations were with local DAs. I could kind of tell that was maybe where she was getting a lot of her information. And so I sent an open record, like I can't ask the journalists for emails, but I can ask the DA for their email, because if they're using their state email, that's all subject to open records requests. So I submitted open records requests with DAs. I got some emails, and I will just say they were unflattering to the journalist. She was like literally emailing the Tulsa DA, like looking for like a murder. She was like, I want somebody who died and the person got out of jail. You know, like it was just like really gross. And so they pushed back. You know, I had done some reporting. So an old information officer for the state had gotten mad at some reporting that I had done for the Atlantic. So I got some pushback from that. I think the podcast got some pushback from Cherokees who are like anti-Ridge. So there was like some Facebook chatter, but nothing too bad. So yeah, so far I've only been threatened to be sued, but no one's ever filed a lawsuit. So. And usually people who say they're gonna sue you don't sue you. The people who are actually gonna sue you just filed the lawsuit. Tip. Any other questions? Yeah.
It's kind of a personal question, so you can choose, obviously, to answer it or not. But in my own spiritual journey, I have a rudimentary knowledge of Native American spirituality, so that's a broad subject. Just interested in your own journey.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it's not something I like talk about publicly a lot, but I will say, you know, I didn't grow up in a traditional family or connected to Cherokee culture in a traditional way. So my grandma moved to Oklahoma City when she was 11, and then by the time I came up, my family was in Joplin. And so I've connected to what I know of like my culture and my language as an adult. And I think that, you know, for me, I think what is the most guiding about that is that whether it's, even just like the mechanics of how our language works, or how our ceremonies work, is that it's never really about like the individual or the one person. It's about like the collective and the group. And so, and that's hard to do when you're like writing a book, right? Because you're like, I am Rebecca Nagle, I wrote my book. So that's something that I try to stay very grounded in. I think particularly in the political moment that we're in, I think it's really important for us to think about like our smaller communities and like the people that we can like build together with, and like how we're in relationship with other people. So that's something I feel like I can share. Yeah, but thank you for asking that. And then there was another question right over there. Yeah.
I've always been really curious about how the Ridges ended up in Fayetteville. I always thought, why didn't they go to Oklahoma when the rest of the tribe went to Oklahoma? Now I know that was very, very tragic and very interesting. But wouldn't it have been better if they'd been further away from Oklahoma? I just wonder why they picked Fayetteville. Do you have any idea?
I don't know. They moved to Fayetteville after the assassinations, and so so originally they settled like after. So the Major Ridge and John Ridge came over before the Trail of Tears, and so there were maybe like 2,000 people that moved west between like the treaty being signed and the roundup of people being rounded up into concentration camps. But the overwhelming majority of the tribe like refused to go. And so they came over before the Trail of Tears, and they settled on land that's still in our family. Our cousin Nancy Brown takes care of it today. But they built a house and lived near Honey Creek, which is like they're basically on the very, very, very edge of Cherokee Nation. And so, yeah, you might know more than I do about exactly what year the family moved to Fayetteville. But my understanding, it was just after the assassinations. Yeah. Yeah, so I think they're just trying to get, and it's this time where, because like we talk about the assassinations, but there was a lot of like ongoing violence. And so like over 150 people are murdered in a few years. It looks like it might spin out into a civil war. And so there are the initial assassinations, but then there's a bunch of retaliatory killing that goes back and forth. And so, yeah, I think they came here from safety. And from where they were in, like northeastern Oklahoma, Fayetteville is pretty close.
Have you been to the Ridge House? It's not far from here.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I need to go back there. But yeah, I know it's cool. So they have a special connection to Fayetteville. So it's cool to be here. Yeah.
I think you both mentioned the long game. And are you waiting to see something in particular in the long game that's going to indicate to you a movement away from the morass that exists right now, the pendulum swinging back and forth and back and forth, to something that's going to bring back some of that appreciation of some of that maternal economy, maybe some of that respect of the land, some of the things that are shared, at least it seems to me, from what little I know, among indigenous people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the long game is that like it's not like an arrival, it's like constantly being done, right? And so our tribes are doing that work, whether it's teaching children the languages, caring for land, caring for culture. And so, I think like even in that passage that I shared from my ancestors where they're talking about the decision to move west, like they're saying if it was just for us, we would stay here and die and be buried here. That's what we would rather die and be buried here than move. But we know if we stay here, our children won't survive and our children's won't survive. And so I think that, I don't know. I mean, maybe there will one day be an end to colonization. That would be great. But I think in the meantime, I think what indigenous peoples and indigenous nations have done we have always had ways, whether or not those ways were sanctioned by and supported by the U.S. government or not, of maintaining the things that are important to us. right? And so I think that that's the work that, you know, generations of Native people have done before us and that generations will do moving forward. So then I don't know if we need to wrap up for time. Okay, cool. Cool.
Yeah. Exactly. Oh, I mean, like my 2 cents to that is that, yeah, exactly. I mean, it boils down to colonization and the fact that, you know, our homes are here. And I don't think that if the day were to ever come, we would ever achieve that, because there's just so much that needs to happen in order for us to get to that perfect realm of what was. And even then, so we're also assuming that our people right now know what that was like. You know, like for me, I even though I grew up on the Navajo reservation and I grew up with a very traditional family household, there is still so much stuff that I don't even know. And I'm very fortunate that I work in a museum where I get to study my people's history as a profession. And I'm still relearning these things. But, you know, I think that slowly, generation after generation, we are getting into that area where I think this is, if my ancestors were to think of a future that would exist into the world that it is now, it's close to perfect. And, you know, we're still doing a lot of fighting. We have to take into consideration that, you know, it wasn't even until like 1940 that, you know, indigenous people weren't considered citizens. And then in the 1970s, we were finally able to have our kids not go to boarding schools or simulation schools. And also, it wasn't until 1990 that we were like legally able to speak our languages in public schools. So we still have lots to do, and it is just barely happening. So maybe one day, I'd love to see it though. Yeah, that's it. I think that's it. Yeah, we're done.
Well, thank you everyone so much for coming, and thank you to the Fayetteville Public Library for hosting. And then I think we are going to do like book signing in the back if anybody wants to get my John Hancock. So see you guys back there. Okay.